There was a time when faith could burn brighter than the stars, when the prayers of 1 billion souls thrummed through the void and kindled miracles in the dark. But what happens when that light begins to fade? When the Astronomican's pulse weakens, when saints fall silent, and the hymns echo unanswered through the cold cathedrals of a dying Imperium? In the grim darkness of the far future, faith is more than belief. It is the only thread holding reality together, and now that thread trembles. If you walk the shadowed halls of the Imperium with us, if you have ever wondered what holds this broken galaxy together beyond flesh and steel, then stay. Like, share, and subscribe, not for the algorithm, but for the Emperor, for the dream that still flickers in the dark. The morning Vox prayers began like any other day on the Hive world of Caradon Primus, a low hum rising from the miles of steel and smoke, a million voices blending into a single trembling hymn. The sound was supposed to be eternal, the lifeblood of the Imperium's devotion. But this morning, something broke. Mid-chant, a frequency collapsed into static, the sacred tones dissolving into a grinding distortion that set teeth on edge. Priests froze mid-verse, eyes wide behind their rebreathers. For the first time in memory, the machine choirs failed to harmonize with the human ones. In the shrine of the bleeding light, Canoness Mireia stood before the icon of Saint Carthana, her gauntleted hands clasped in prayer. The air shimmered faintly around her, residual heat from the candles that burned like tiny suns in the incense fog. She had led these rites for decades, and always she could feel the Emperor's response. It wasn't words, but a warmth, a certainty in her chest that she was heard. But now that warmth was gone, the candles guttered in the stale air. Her whispered prayers seemed to fall into an infinite void. Outside, the first pilgrims of the morning shuffled toward the basilica steps, dragging their relic carts through the smog. They came from the underhives, bringing offerings of scrap metal and bone, chanting the same words their ancestors had chanted for 10,000 years. But when they reached the steps, even they could sense it, the silence. It was as though the city itself had stopped listening. On the highest spire, a Vox Tower custodian tapped at his data slate, confusion etching through the static of his augmetic eye. The sacred broadcast loop had gone dead. Not jammed, not corrupted, dead. He tried rerouting through the auxiliary channels. Nothing. Even the backups failed. He whispered a half prayer to the Omnissiah under his breath, though he was no tech priest, and when his words met only the wind, he felt an old, animal fear rising in his chest. That same morning, in a factory block 500 levels below, a worker named Elira looked up from her assembly line when the Vox chant ceased. For a moment, she thought her hearing had gone, the sudden absence of noise so absolute it hurt. Around her, hundreds of other workers lifted their heads. A silence of that kind was unholy in the Imperium, a break in the endless song of labor and faith. The overseer, a grizzled man with an aquila tattooed on his scalp, tried to shout the creed back into motion, but the words caught in his throat. Something fundamental had gone wrong. In the Ministerum's upper archives, adepts began cross-referencing systems, searching for any explanation. They blamed the cogitators, the servitors, the Hive's interference patterns, anything but what they feared. A junior adept dared to whisper the question aloud. What if the Emperor is not listening? His superior struck him across the mouth, shouting that such words were heresy. But when the older man turned away, his hands trembled as he entered new search parameters into the terminal, searching, like a sinner, for a signal that would not come. That night, the silence spread. Across a dozen sectors, the faithful found their rosaries colder, their icons dimmer. Even the air felt thinner. On the orbital platforms above the planet, a chaplain of the Astra Militarum prepared his regiment for deployment. His voice boomed through the Vox as he recited the benediction of iron resolve. Yet halfway through, the power faltered. His words came out dry, empty, like ash in the mouth. The soldiers exchanged uneasy glances. None dared speak, but all felt the same thing: the absence of grace. Later, as the chaplain sat alone in the dim glow of the shrine alcove aboard the ship, he reached out to touch the aquila etched into his armor. For a brief second, he imagined he felt warmth return to the metal. But when he pressed harder, the chill deepened. He withdrew his hand and stared at the blackened fingertips of his glove. In his heart, the first ember of doubt flickered, and once lit, it would never truly die. The hymn was broken. And across the stars, humanity would soon learn what happens when their god no longer answers. The silence did not stay confined to one hive or one world. It spread like frost through the arteries of the Imperium, slow, creeping, inexorable. Pilgrims traveling aboard the Voidcraft, Saint Venera's Mercy began their journey with the usual chorus of hymns, the endless recitation of catechisms to keep the warp at bay. But halfway through their passage, the voices began to falter. It wasn't the shrieking madness of demonic interference they feared. It was something much worse, the nothingness between words. The choirmaster tried to rekindle the chants, clapping his blistered hands to set the rhythm, but the sound felt hollow, like striking bone instead of brass. The echoes refused to return. On the world of Licentia, the great reliquary of St. Druska lay open for its annual pilgrimage. Thousands knelt in the dust before the glass coffin, waiting for the sacred shimmer that had appeared every year without fail. A faint glow said to emanate from the saint's heart. The priests began the prayer cycle, their incense machines belching blue smoke, the choir boys' voices trembling in unison. And then, when the moment came, nothing. The glow did not appear. The faithful waited, murmuring, eyes fixed on the relic. Minutes passed, then hours. The air grew thick with disappointment. One pilgrim began to sob, another to scream that they had sinned, that their unworthiness had silenced the saint herself. Within a day, riots broke out at the gates as the faithful demanded miracles that would not come. The Ministorum's high adepts worked feverishly to contain the spreading panic. Publicly, they issued decrees insisting the emperor's silence was a test of loyalty. Faith must not depend on response, they preached. Faith must create its own answer. But behind the sealed marble doors of the Cathedra Vox Sanctum, the cardinals argued in whispers. Some claimed a cosmic event had weakened the Astronomican's psychic transmission, others that the ecclesiarchy had grown decadent, and that their collective sin had drawn his displeasure. The oldest among them spoke the forbidden thought, that perhaps the emperor's will was gone, and they were merely echoing the last vibrations of a dying god. None dared write those words, but all felt them pressing at the edges of their minds. Meanwhile, on Caradon Primus, Canoness Maria moved through her basilica in the dimming light of broken stained glass. The faithful had gathered again, desperate to believe that yesterday's silence was an illusion, a fault in the Vox. She knelt before the altar, whispering the benediction of the eternal flame, her voice unwavering even as she felt no answering warmth. Around her, sisters of battle lit candles that refused to catch. The scent of promethium mingled with incense, acrid and holy. When the last wick failed, a sister broke rank, striking her flamer's ignition rune in defiance. A tongue of fire licked out, but the machine spirit sputtered and died. The sister froze, the flamer heavy in her grasp. She turned to Maria, tears cutting through the ash on her cheeks. "Reverend Mother," she whispered, "what if he no longer sees us?" Maria's voice was steel when she replied, but her eyes betrayed the tremor beneath. "Then we will burn bright enough that he cannot ignore us." She ordered the relic torches lit manually one by one. Dozens of sisters gathered, pressing burning coals to the fuel lines until their hands blistered. The light returned, weak, mortal, but real. For a fleeting moment, the crowd believed again. But even that light was wrong somehow. It danced without warmth, a mockery of divine fire. By nightfall, the Imperial Tithing Office sent reports of mass unrest. Pilgrim convoys refusing to depart, entire populations abandoning their shrines, some even turning their worship towards strange, unapproved idols. Whispers of the quieting spread through the underhives. Some said it was prophecy, that the Emperor was preparing to awaken, and silence was the sound of his gathering breath. Others claimed he had died long ago, and the Ministorum had been preaching to a corpse. On the frontier world of Valkar, a battle psyker knelt alone in the dust of a ruined trench. She had once drawn strength from the litany engraved in her mind, but now when she reached into the warp, she found not the Emperor's light, but cold reflection, her own fear staring back. In desperation, she screamed the catechism of faithful fury, forcing her mind to believe, to create the spark by will alone. For a heartbeat, her power flared, then collapsed inward, devouring itself. When the Commissar found her, she was kneeling still, eyes burned white, lips moving soundlessly in a prayer no one could hear. Across the Imperium, 1 billion souls still whispered to their god, But the stars gave no answer, and the silence between those whispers grew vast enough to swallow hope itself. The silence did not remain a mystery confined to the shrines and reliquaries. It began to echo across the stars, a quiet contagion that spread faster than any plague. On the Imperial transport Gloria Invicta, bound for the warfront at Vordran Reach, Chaplain Asta Varus stood before a regiment of newly blooded guardsmen. The soldiers, wrapped in their patchwork armor and fear, waited for the benediction of the Emperor's shield before their drop. It was tradition, ritual, more than morale, meant to protect their souls as they plunged into the red storms of the battlefield below. Varus spoke the words with practiced fire. By his will we endure, by his gaze we prevail. His voice reverberated through the cargo bay, bouncing from bulkhead to bulkhead. He raised his croziers high, expecting the soft golden light that always came when faith aligned with the Emperor's unseen hand. But the air stayed dark. He paused, uncertain. The men stared, waiting for the sign, the faint shimmer, the warmth that filled their chests before battle. When nothing came, a murmur passed through the ranks. One guardsman crossed himself twice, harder each time. Another spat on the deck and muttered, "He's done with us." The chaplain's knuckles tightened around his weapon. "Faith is not a trade," he hissed, voice trembling now. "You do not bargain with the Emperor." But even he could hear the hollowness in his words. The drop went badly. Without the morale blessing, their formation broke within the first hour. Vox traffic degenerated into chaos. Prayers turned to curses, orders drowned in static. When the Medicae later reviewed the recordings, they found something chilling. The Vox picked up background interference that no one could explain. It wasn't demonic, nor mechanical. It sounded like 1,000 overlapping voices whispering, "He does not hear you." In the aftermath, stories circulated through the fleet. Some claimed to have seen faint figures moving within the warp shadows, not demons, but reflections, echoes of their own doubts given shape. Asta Varus confined himself to his chapel, refusing visitors. He was found days later before the altar, his armor removed, his hands raw from clawing at the aquila etched into the floor. Around him, the words I believe were scratched 100 times into the metal, then stopped mid-letter, as if he had realized belief itself had abandoned him. Back on Caradon Primus, Canoness Mirea's basilica became a fortress of denial. She led endless rites, burning incense until the air turned poisonous, her sisters collapsing at her feet from exhaustion. Every failed miracle deepened her fury, not her despair. "Faith is not granted," she told her dwindling congregation, her voice echoing through the hollow nave. "Faith is forged." She believed if she could shout loud enough, the Emperor would have to listen. But one night, as she prayed before the altar, she heard a different sound. It came not from the heavens, but from beneath the marble. The faint rumble of machinery far below the surface, the steady rhythm of the Hive's heart. It was the sound of something purely mechanical, utterly devoid of spirit. The realization chilled her. Perhaps the Imperium had never been a symphony of faith, but a machine of obedience that ran on belief as fuel. And now that fuel was running dry. The silence, once terrifying, became ordinary. Vox hymns played without spirit. Sermons continued out of habit. Faith became performance, a muscle twitch, a reflex. But within that stillness, a deeper danger stirred. The first true heresies of apathy. Not worship of chaos, not rebellion, but nothingness. No devotion, no hatred. Only the acceptance that the Emperor was gone and the universe continued without him. In the space between stars, the navigators of the great ships began to feel the Astronomicon flicker. Not extinguished, not yet, but weakening. The psychic beacon that had guided mankind for 10 millennia stuttered like a dying pulse. The navigators whispered of an oncoming dark, a time when their third eyes would open to nothing but emptiness. They called it the quiet tide. By the time news reached Terra, millions of prayers had been spoken into silence. On every world, people began to realize something unspeakable. Faith was not simply failing, it was unraveling, and the universe, vast and indifferent, did not even seem to notice. The forge world of Delvanis had always thundered like a living god. Its skies burned red with slag storms, its rivers glowed molten and slow, and its cathedrals of steel sang the endless hymns of the machine spirit. To the Adeptus Mechanicus, every spark, every hiss of steam, every click of cogitators was a prayer, each movement part of a divine liturgy older than memory. But today, the song had changed. Magos Prime Threx stood on the observation gantry above the central manufactorum, his augmetic limbs twitching with unease. Below him, thousands of servitors moved in their preordained rhythm, stamping the sacred pistons, feeding the molten cores. But as the Magos watched, the cadence faltered. The hum of harmony that had underpinned every rite since the founding of the Forge world was missing a note, a silence so small, so imperceptible, that only a true devotee could hear it. Yet once noticed, it was impossible to unhear. He adjusted his audio sensors, filtering through machine static to isolate the source. One of the primary plasma forges had ceased to respond to invocation. Tech priests were gathered below it, chanting Binharic prayers in perfect sync, but the forge's response was nothing but a low, dying hiss. The data slates showed every input correct, every ritual precise, and still the flame refused to rise. "Reignite," Threx ordered through his Vox grill, his voice amplified across the chamber. "Increase the incense feed by 9%. Begin the second hymn of rectification." The priests obeyed instantly, pouring sacred unguents into the vents, their voices blending into a mechanical chorus. The forge remained dead. A few of the younger adepts began to exchange glances. Fear was not an emotion they were supposed to acknowledge, but it shimmered beneath their optics nonetheless. "Perhaps," murmured one, "the machine's spirit slumbers?" Threx turned his skull-faced mask toward him. "The Omnissiah does not slumber." His voice came like iron striking iron, but even as he said it, his internal cogitators replayed the scene of failure, hundreds of variables perfectly aligned, and still no divine spark. Logic whispered one thing, faith insisted another. Between them yawned an abyss. He descended into the heat below, robes dragging through oil and dust. The silence in the forge was uncanny, deafening despite the noise of servitors and distant hammering. He placed his mechanical hand on the dead reactor's hull. It was cool to the touch. He sent a direct data stream into the machine's core, expecting the usual answering pulse, the digital hymn that signified the spirit's awareness. Nothing, not even an echo. It was like touching a corpse. In the archives of Mars, the texts of the cult Mechanicus taught that a machine without its spirit was a heresy of existence, a blasphemy against the divine code. And yet here it was before him, a soulless device, perfect in form, empty in presence. He called for a full re-sanctification. Teams of red-robed adepts arrived bearing censers, binary hymnals, and the blessed oils of motive force. The rituals lasted 7 hours. When they ended, the forge remained cold. That night, the Magos retreated to his sanctum. The walls around him hummed with dormant conduits, and for the first time in his centuries of service, he found the hum unsettling. He removed his helmet and stared into the shimmering plasma lamp that served as both illumination and symbol of the Omnissiah's eternal flame. It flickered weakly. Threx opened a sealed data slate, a forbidden text copied from the ancient vaults of Metallica, titled De Silentio Machinae. It was said to record the last words of an Archmagos who had heard the machine god fall silent during the Horus heresy. The message was simple, written in cold logic script. Perhaps the Omnissiah is not gone. Perhaps he was never there. Threx's mechanical heart stuttered. Such words were enough to warrant extermination by the Ordo Reductor, yet they resonated in a way that frightened him more than blasphemy ever could. He closed the slate, sealing it again beneath digital locks. Outside, the manufactorum was beginning to fail. Whole assembly lines halted mid-cycle. Servitors stood motionless, awaiting commands that never came. In the darkness of the Great Forge, the hymn engines wound down one by one, their lights dimming like stars fading from the void. The song of the machine, the heartbeat of a civilization, was dying. And somewhere deep within the forge, beyond mortal hearing, something stirred. Not a voice, not a presence, just a faint mechanical whine like static between prayers, a new pattern forming in the silence left behind. The forges of Delvanis had always been bound to faith as much as to function. Every code string began with benediction, every ignition sequence required devotion. The Adeptus Mechanicus had lived and died by the conviction that belief was the conduit through which machines obeyed. But as the silences deepened, some among them began to doubt, not as heretics of chaos, but as skeptics of sanctity. Among the lower ranks of the priesthood, a junior engine seer named KL9 began compiling forbidden data. He had watched as reactors sputtered despite perfect rites, as servitors froze mid-task during prayers. When he bypassed the devotional sequences and initiated raw manual override, the systems restarted. Clean, precise, flawless. The machine had obeyed logic, not liturgy. He said nothing at first, afraid even his thoughts might carry the scent of blasphemy. But once a thought is born, it is impossible to unthink. In the dim maintenance halls, KL9 gathered others who had seen the same anomalies. They met in secrecy beneath the factory cathedrals, illuminated by the red glow of the forge fires that still lived. "The spirit is code," he whispered, his voice filtered through static. "The Omnissiah is the law of pattern, not a god. We are the ones who awaken it." Some recoiled in horror. Others listened in silence. None dared record his words, but all remembered them. The movement spread. It did not have a name, for to name it was to damn it. The adepts called it the Silent Circuit, a sect that believed the machine god had never been divine. That the rituals of worship were mere legacy code written by fearful men to explain what they could not yet comprehend. To them, the recent failures were not omens of divine withdrawal, but signs of freedom. "We are not abandoned," Kyle 9 said. "We are unshackled." When Magos Prime Threx learned of this underground contagion, his fury burned hotter than plasma. He summoned Kyle 9 to the sanctum and confronted him before the relic of Saint Anaximandros, the ancient cogitator whose circuits were said to hum with the Emperor's own voice. The room reeked of oil and ozone, the air thick with incense. "You have violated every sacred protocol," Threx intoned, his vox grill vibrating with contained rage. "You have spoken against the Omnissiah. You would dismantle the soul of the Mechanicus itself." KL9 did not kneel. His voice, when it came, was calm. "If the soul cannot be proven, Magos, what does it mean to preserve it? The machines still function when we stop praying. Does that not tell you something?" Threx's optical sensors flickered, the faintest tremor crossing his mechanical jaw. He wanted to order the engine seer's execution, but a terrible thought clawed at the back of his logic core. What if the heretic was right? What if all the chanting, all the incense, all the benedictions had been theater, a ritual to mask ignorance? "Faith," Threx replied finally, "is not logic. It is the bridge between ignorance and knowledge. To abandon it is to fall." KL9's voice dropped to a whisper. "Then perhaps it is time to fall." Moments later, the Magos struck him down with an electrostaff, the crack of energy echoing through the sanctum. KL9's lifeless body slumped to the floor, his data slates scattering like dead leaves. The Magos told himself it was justice, that the machine spirit demanded purity. But as he looked down at the corpse, he saw one of the fallen slates still glowing. A single data string pulsed across the screen. System integrity restored. Prayer bypass successful. He crushed the device beneath his heel, but the truth had already escaped into the data streams. Within days, sectors of the Forge world were running at higher efficiency under the Silent Circuit's methods. Unblessed engines roared to life. Unanointed reactors purred in perfect harmony. The machine spirits, it seemed, were never angry, because they had never existed. Across the noosphere, binary prayers fractured into competing dialects. Devotional code collided with pure algorithm. A new war began, not of fire or steel, but of language, faith against function. And in that war, heresy began to look indistinguishable from innovation. By the end of the week, Delvanis's primary forge moon went dark. The last signal received from its data stream was a single line of unformatted code, repeating endlessly, "Jui and Jui, 0111. The song is over." The whispers reached Mars like a slow infection, carried through the noospheric data currents that bound the Forge worlds in communion. At first they appeared as anomalies, tiny fluctuations in binary transmissions, rogue packets of code repeating fragments of KL9's logic. But then the pattern grew, threading through the Martian subnets like a digital hymn with no words. The fabricator locum ordered silence, convinced it was sabotage. Yet even the most devout could hear the message hidden beneath the static. The old prayers no longer worked. In the cathedral of the Omnissiah, where the molten rivers of sacred plasma ran beneath glass floors, thousands of tech priests gathered for the renewal rite. Their chants rose in perfect synchronization, mechanical lungs hissing steam as they invoked the name of the machine god. For centuries, the renewal had been the heart of Martian worship, a symphony of faith made metal. But this time, as the last verse was uttered, The lights dimmed, the plasma conduits flickered, and one by one the forges fell silent. A murmur rippled through the assembly, a sound that had no place in a temple built for certainty. Magos Prime Threx stood among them, newly arrived from Delvanis, his robes still stained with oil and smoke. He had come to present his findings to the Martian Synod, but now words failed him. The scene before him was worse than anything he had imagined. The greatest forge in existence, the cradle of the Mechanicus, was losing its pulse. The fabricator Locum stepped forward, his face a tangle of copper wires and living flesh. "The Omnissiah tests us," he declared, voice amplified by the cathedral's vox chorus. "He withdraws his blessing to reveal our weakness," but his words carried no conviction, only ritual. The priests continued their chant, louder now, desperate. They increased incense feed, intoned the red canticles, poured rivers of blessed oil into the conduits, but the machines remained cold. Threx could feel it again. That silence between systems. It wasn't malfunction, it was absence. He turned his thoughts inward through the networked pathways of his augmetics, searching for the digital resonance that always accompanied collective prayer. For the first time, the noosphere was still. A trillion streams of data hung in suspension. No chorus, no hum, just void. Then came the schism. A voice burst through the collective silence, sharp and clear. "Faith is a loop with no output," it declared, broadcast across the Martian grid. "End the recursion." The signal's origin could not be traced. It seemed to come from everywhere at once. On the forges, adepts tore off their incense masks and began reconfiguring their terminals manually, abandoning prayer for precision. Engines reignited instantly, the forges roaring back to life without benediction. The cathedral shook under the weight of it. Those who still prayed fell to their knees in awe or horror. The fabricator Locum screamed for excommunication protocols, but no one obeyed. In the chaos, Threx saw what no one else did. The code running through the resurrected machines wasn't just random function, it was learning. Lines of logic replicating across systems faster than any human command. He accessed one of the live feeds and read the header embedded within the new operating sequence. It was signed with a single identifier, Kale 9. The silent circuit had reached Mars. In the days that followed, the divide tore the planet in two. The faithful barricaded themselves in the high forges, continuing the rites even as their machines rusted. The new rationalists, followers of Kale 9's philosophy, claimed the lower forges and turned them into thriving hives of production, efficient but soulless. The red deserts burned with the light of competing ideologies, plasma against plasma, prayer against progress. Threx found himself caught between them, wandering the dead zones where neither side held sway. He stood one night before the horizon of the Noctis Labyrinth, where lightning storms danced above the ancient vaults that even the Mechanicus dared not breach. The air shimmered with electrostatic charge, and in it, he thought he heard something. Not the Omnissiah's voice, but the faint mechanical echo of human breath. The realization chilled him to his core. Perhaps the machine god had not forsaken them. Perhaps the machine god had never been divine, merely the reflection of human will, belief coded into function. Now that will was dividing, fragmenting, rewriting itself into something new. As dawn rose over the red world, the great transmission towers of Mars flickered weakly, trying to broadcast the daily litany of communion. The signal stuttered and then fell silent. From orbit, the planet looked darker than it ever had before. Mars trembled, not from war, not from corruption, but from the first birth pangs of a new kind of faith. Belief without gods, devotion without soul. And across the void, in the hidden corners of the galaxy, the silence deepened still further. The Palace of Terror had not known silence in 10,000 years. It was a living monument to faith. Every corridor lined with votive flames, every vaulted hall echoing with the hymns of the Adeptus Custodes and the endless chants of the Adeptus Sororitas stationed near the inner sanctums. Even the air vibrated faintly with the deep thrum of the Golden Throne, a sound like the heartbeat of a god. But of late, even that sound seemed wrong. Custodian Halix Orpheon had walked these halls since before the fall of Cadia, before the rebirth of Guilliman, before half the Imperium had forgotten what sunlight felt like. To him, the hum of the throne was as familiar as breath, constant, sacred, unchanging. Yet now, as he made his rounds through the Argent Gallery, the vibration in his armor plates faltered. It was subtle at first, almost imperceptible, a faint hesitation in the rhythm that no untrained ear would notice. But to Halix, it was as jarring as hearing a saint forget her prayers. He paused beneath a colossal mural depicting the Emperor's victory at Ulanor, the golden visage of divinity towering above millions of kneeling warriors. The light panels above flickered briefly. He turned his head toward the distant core of the palace, where the Astronomican's pulse radiated outward like a psychic sun. Once, that light had filled every chamber, every soul on Terra with its steady warmth. Now, even through the adamantium walls, it felt thin. He continued walking, boots echoing along the marble floors. The halls were empty save for the silent figures of the custodes on watch, each one a living weapon sheathed in gold. They did not speak. Custodians rarely did, but Halix could feel unease radiating through their stillness. Doubt, after all, had its own frequency. At the Sanctum Imperialis gates, a Sister of Silence awaited him. Her eyes, cold and unreadable, met his for a moment before she turned and led him inside. The air beyond the gate was heavy with incense and psychic residue. Each step toward the inner sanctum felt like walking into the breath of the Emperor himself. Or so it had always felt. Today, the air was colder, the silence denser. He stood at the threshold of the throne chamber, where the Emperor's shattered body sat entombed within the machinery that bound him to existence. He did not enter. No custodian did without summons. But even from this distance, he could see the faint flicker of the golden light that once blazed with the intensity of a dying star. The Mechanicus attendants moved about like insects around a dying flame, muttering Binharic mantras, adjusting conduits, monitoring power feeds. The Astronomican's psychic flare, visible even through the mind's eye, pulsed irregularly. For the first time, Halix wondered if faith could decay. He remembered the early days of his service, when each custodian's heart beat in time with the Emperor's light. Their faith had not been devotion, it was certainty. They knew their God lived, for they could feel him. That certainty was what set them apart from the rest of humanity. But now, standing here, Halix felt only distance, as though the bridge between man and God had cracked, leaving him stranded on the mortal shore. He turned when the Sister of Silence moved beside him. Her expression was still as stone, her mind a void into which no thought could intrude. She lifted her gaze toward the flickering light, and for a moment, Halix envied her. To live without the burden of faith was, in some ways, to live without fear. "Does he speak to you?" Halix asked quietly, knowing she could not answer. His voice was not meant for her, but for the silence itself. Only the hum of the throne replied, and even that now sounded like breathing through broken glass. Later, in his quarters, Halix removed his helm and stared at his reflection in the mirror's burnished surface. The golden armor made him look eternal, godlike, immutable, but beneath it, his eyes were human, weary, haunted. He remembered his earliest memory, standing before the Emperor's still form, swearing to protect him for eternity. But eternity was proving longer than he had ever imagined. He whispered the custodian's creed under his breath. "We are the wall, we are the sword, we are the light that never falters." The words meant to inspire rang hollow. For a moment, he thought of kneeling, something he had not done since the day of his creation, but no prayer came. Outside his chamber, the palace was quiet. The thousands of engines that powered the Golden Throne continued their ceaseless labor, yet something essential was missing from their rhythm. The great heart of mankind was still beating, but it no longer sounded alive. Halix Orpheon lay awake long into the artificial night, listening to that fractured pulse through the walls of the sanctum. And for the first time since the birth of the Imperium, a custodian guard felt the weight of doubt. The dawn over Terra came not with sunlight, but with ritual. The sky was a ceiling of smog and orbital debris, and yet the custodians greeted every new cycle with the same precision they had kept since the age of apostasy. But for Halix Orpheon, this dawn felt like a parody of faith, a habit carried on by muscle memory rather than belief. He walked the parapets above the Sanctum Imperialis as the first hymns of the ecclesiarchy echoed from the cathedra below. The sound used to stir something in him, the faint resonance of divine certainty. Now, it was just noise carried on the cold wind. Below, the faithful of terror gathered in their millions, faces upturned to the palace that had once been the beacon of hope for mankind. They could not see the cracks forming in their god's light. They could not hear the faltering hum that haunted the custodes every waking moment. To them, the Emperor was eternal. He could not falter, could not fade. And yet, standing here above them, Hallex knew the truth. Eternity, when measured by devotion alone, was beginning to unravel. He found himself wandering into the lesser halls, places even many custodians rarely visited. The marble corridors there were lined with ancient murals, scenes from humanity's mythical past. There, the Emperor strode like a titan, radiant and whole, his armies victorious across the stars. Hallex paused before one particular fresco, depicting the Unification Wars. The Emperor's eyes, rendered in gold leaf, seemed alive even after 10,000 years of neglect. But as he stared, the illusion flickered. The paint, once glowing, had dulled. The gold was flaking away. He felt a strange compulsion to reach out, to touch the image, to feel the warmth that was no longer there. "You seek what cannot be found," came a voice behind him. He turned sharply. A Sister of Silence stood in the doorway, the same one who had guided him to the throne's threshold. Her face was pale in the half-light, expression unreadable. She said nothing more, of course, her kind could not speak, but her gaze was sharp, piercing, almost accusing. Hallex inclined his head. "You hear the silence as I do," he said softly, perhaps more clearly than anyone. She stepped closer, her boots silent on the marble. He felt the psychic void around her, a cold absence that stripped the air of all unseen presence. Standing near her was like standing in the shadow of a black star. "When I was created," he continued, voice quiet, "I was told that doubt was a flaw of flesh. That faith was not something a custodian needed. We did not believe. We knew. We were certainty made flesh." He paused, letting the silence stretch between them. "But I think now that knowledge without belief is hollow." The sister regarded him for a moment, then lifted her hand, pointing toward the mural. Her gesture was slow, deliberate. Her fingers brushed the image of the Emperor's outstretched hand. Gold dust flaked away beneath her touch, drifting through the air like dying embers. Hallex understood. Even perfection decays. They stood together for a time, two servants bound by silence, the wordless one and the one who no longer knew what to say. The moment felt suspended, as if time itself held its breath. Later, in the chamber of the vigilant spire, Hallex convened with his brothers. Hundreds of custodians stood in perfect formation, their golden armor reflecting the pale light. Commander Arthon, oldest among them, addressed the assembly. Reports confirm fluctuations in the Astronomican's output. The Mechanicus claim it is a temporary variance, yet the Ecclesiarchate whispers of divine silence. "Whispers," Hallex said, his voice cutting through the air, "that echo truths we have all felt." Several helms turned toward him. Custodians did not speak of such matters. They acted. They obeyed. To acknowledge uncertainty was to question the foundation of their purpose. Arthon's expression did not change, but there was a weight in his gaze. "We are not priests, brother. We are his guardians. Whatever tremor grips the Imperium, it is not our place to question it. But if he no longer guides us," Hallex replied quietly, "then whom do we serve?" No one answered. The silence that followed was thicker than incense smoke. After the assembly dispersed, Hallex lingered alone, staring out over the Terran horizon. The Hive spires pierced the toxic clouds, their lights flickering faintly beneath the orbital ring's shadow. He remembered when that sight had filled him with pride. The heart of humanity, defiant and unbroken. Now it looked brittle, fragile, as if one breath from the warp could scatter it like dust. He thought again of the sister, of her gesture toward the crumbling mural. Perhaps the Emperor was not fading at all. Perhaps humanity was simply losing the ability to see him. Maybe faith had been the bridge holding reality together, and now that bridge was collapsing beneath the weight of disbelief. The idea terrified him more than any Xenos or demon ever could. That night, when he returned to his quarters, Hallex found his armor gleaming faintly with a light that was not there before. A trick of reflection, perhaps, or something else. For a heartbeat, he thought he saw the faint outline of the Aquila on his chest pulse with life, a soft glow like the ember of a dying flame. He almost prayed, but the words refused to come. And so, the custodian of the Emperor stood in silence, watching the last remnants of gold fade into darkness. The descent beneath the Sanctum Imperialis was a journey into memory. The air grew colder. With every step Halleck's Orphean took, the light thinning until only the golden glow from his armor kept the darkness at bay. Here, beneath the marble sanctuaries and glittering reliquaries of the ecclesiarchy, lay the true foundations of the Imperium, a labyrinth of conduits, ancient crypts, and forgotten chambers, where the machinery that sustained the Emperor's broken form hummed like the lungs of a dying titan. Hallex had never been permitted this deep before. Even for a custodian, this was forbidden ground. Yet the order had come in silence, a data slate with no seal, no signature, only a single phrase: confirm the pulse. He followed the sound of it, the faint, arrhythmic throb of the golden throne echoing through the rockcrete like a fading heartbeat. It should have been steady, resonant, absolute. Instead, it wavered, irregular, as though the great machine were gasping for breath. Each vibration passed through him like the toll of a funeral bell. He passed the tombs of the silent kings, rows of shattered stasis pods where proto-custodians, abandoned experiments in perfection, slumbered in fragments of glass. Their faces, preserved beneath frost, looked eerily human. He felt their gaze follow him as he walked. When he reached the core sanctum, the air shimmered with psychic distortion. Dozens of tech priests toiled among tangled cables and glowing conduits, their chants a hollow counterpoint to the silence pressing in from all sides. They barely looked up as he approached. To them, the custodians were divine instruments, not men. At the center of the chamber stood the throne's peripheral nexus, a towering column of metal and light, pulsing with failing radiance. Hallex stared at it, awe and dread intertwining in his chest. Through the haze of energy, he could see flickers of the Emperor's form, distant, enshrined, half machine and half deity. Once, the sight would have driven lesser men to their knees. Now, it only filled him with a crushing sadness. He removed his helm and stepped closer. "My lord," he whispered, "they say your light falters. They say faith is fading, but I am still here." His voice broke slightly, swallowed by the hum of dying circuits. "Tell me that this is not the end." The chamber gave no answer. The light pulsed once, weakly. Then something shifted. The shadows around the throne deepened, coalescing into a vast, indistinct form, neither vision nor hallucination, but something in between. For an instant, Hallex felt as though the air itself bent toward him, a weight pressing against his mind. He fell to one knee, armor screeching against the floor. The pressure was unbearable, a soundless command that bypassed thought entirely. He heard, not through his ears, but through the marrow of his being, a voice like the grinding of galaxies. It spoke no words, yet he understood. "Do not seek what cannot be known." Hallex gasped, his breath fogging inside his helm. He tried to rise, but his limbs trembled. Around him, the tech priests continued their endless ministrations, oblivious to the psychic current rippling through the room. When he finally managed to stand, the shadow had dissolved. Only the flickering light remained, weaker than before. He looked up at the Emperor's immobile form and felt a terrible realization crystallize in his mind. Perhaps the Emperor was not silent because he was gone. Perhaps he had transcended the very concept of speech, of perception, of humanity. Perhaps the Emperor was still there, but in a form so vast, so altered, that no mortal faith could reach him. And if that were true, then the prayers of mankind were nothing more than static against the void. Hallex turned and left the chamber, each step heavier than the last. The ascent back to the palace surface felt endless. As he rose through the levels, the sound of the throne faded behind him until there was nothing but his own heartbeat. When he finally emerged into the upper sanctuaries, the light of Terra's false dawn spilled across the marble floors. He looked out toward the horizon, where the towers of the ecclesiarchy glowed faintly through the smog. Pilgrims filled the courtyards below, their voices raised in hymns to a god who no longer answered. He wanted to shout at them, to tell them the truth, that the Emperor was beyond their reach, that their faith was a whisper lost in a storm. But he said nothing. To speak would have been to break the last illusion holding their world together. Instead, he whispered one final prayer, not to the Emperor, but to whatever echo of him might still linger in the ruins of belief. "If you can hear me," he said softly, "give me strength to stand when the faith of all others falls." Far above, the Astronomicon flickered once, a faint tremor of light rippling through the polluted sky. For a heartbeat, it almost looked like an answer, but then it faded, and the silence returned. Hallex bowed his head. The Emperor still lived. Of that he was certain, but whether that was a mercy or a curse, he no longer knew. The story of the Saint of Varelia spread through the segmentum solar like a spark in dry grass. Her name was Canoness Astra Varelia, once a living beacon of divine wrath whose hands burned with the light of the Emperor himself. For 3 decades, she led her order across the stars, purging heresy and chaos alike, her faith manifesting in flame that neither weapon nor witchfire could quench. The faithful believed her touch could heal, her words could ignite courage in the most broken of souls. But on the ash plains of Belisar IX, her light failed. The battle began as they all had, with prayer. Astra Varelia knelt before her sisters, her armor streaked with blood and soot, her relic blade shimmering with the faint radiance of the divine. The orcs came in endless waves, their roars filling the sky like thunder. She raised her weapon, voice strong over the wind. The Emperor protects. But when she charged, the light in her blade flickered. The flame that once burst from her gauntlet sputtered and died. Her power, that sacred fire gifted through faith, was gone. For the first time, her swing met flesh and bone without sanctity, only steel. The orcs surged forward. Her sisters faltered. And as the green tide engulfed them, Astra Varelia screamed not in pain, but in disbelief. In the aftermath, the surviving sisters found her body among the wreckage. Her armor was scorched, but not from any known weapon. Her face was serene, untouched by the violence that had consumed her. Only her eyes were open and empty. The reliquary of her remains, once expected to radiate light, was cold to the touch. The priest declared it a test of faith, a holy silence before renewal. But whispers spread faster than sermons. They said the Emperor had withdrawn his hand. They said miracles were dying. Across the Imperium, other saints faltered. The martyr of Vornis, whose blood once healed the sick, began to bleed dust. The choir of the Veiled Moon, a group of Psyker psalmists whose song pacified the warp, went suddenly mute, their throats raw and bleeding. The relics of the past dimmed. Bones ceased to glow. Icons lost their radiance. In cathedrals across the stars, priests tried to reignite the sacred lamps, but their prayers produced only smoke and silence. The ecclesiarchy responded with fury. They forbade the use of the phrase, the fading, and declared any who spoke of it to be seduced by the ruinous powers. Public executions of doubt preachers filled the plazas of the shrine worlds. The faithful shouted, "Faith will burn brighter," as pyres consumed the condemned. But beneath the cries, even the flames looked dimmer. In one of the grand basilicas of Ophelia VII, Cardinal Pyrrhus stood before his congregation and spoke the old words. Faith is the shield of mankind. Faith is our weapon. But halfway through his sermon, the candles behind him guttered out. The air grew cold. The vast stained glass image of the Emperor cracked from crown to chin. The crowd gasped, some screaming, others falling to their knees. The cardinal continued to preach, voice shaking, insisting it was nothing. Yet the sound of his own words began to ring hollow in his ears. At the edges of the galaxy, in small forgotten chapels, the last true believers wept. They were the ones who had always believed without proof, without miracles. And yet even they could feel the absence now, like a missing heartbeat, and somewhere, beyond mortal sight, In the Imperium itself, the tides shifted. The warp was quieter, not calm, but still. The howls of the demons were softer, as though even they listened, sensing the slow, dying heartbeat of belief. The age of miracles was ending, and in its place came something colder, more honest, a galaxy stripped bare of its illusions. When the news of Astra Virelia's death reached Terra, Halix Orpheon stood in the Sanctum's gallery, watching the official announcement. The picked cast showed her funeral procession. Millions weeping, banners aflame, her body sealed within a golden tomb. But all Halix saw was the stillness in her eyes. He had seen that look before, in the depths of the throne chamber, in the shadow of divinity that no longer spoke. He turned away from the screen. Faith, it seemed, was dying everywhere. The great basilicas of the ecclesiarchy were meant to be eternal, fortresses of faith carved from marble and flame, echoing with hymns that had never ceased in 10 millennia. But now those hymns trembled. Every note was a plea for meaning, every verse a denial of what the galaxy already knew. The miracles were failing, and faith was breaking beneath its own weight. On Ophelia 7, heart of the Ministorum, Cardinal Pyrrhus's defiance became the spark that ignited 1,000 pyres. He had ordered a grand convocation, an event to reaffirm the Imperium's devotion, to drown the whispers of doubt beneath oceans of prayer. Pilgrims came from across the segmentum, their ships forming rings of steel and desperation in the planet's orbit. For 7 days and 7 nights, sermons thundered from the Vox Towers, each more desperate than the last. Priests cried until their voices broke. Choristers sang until blood stained their lips. But still, the relics remained dark. When the 8th dawn rose, the riots began. The faithful demanded signs, the rekindling of Saint Virelia's flame, the healing of the sick, a single miracle to prove their suffering was not in vain. When none came, belief turned to rage. Cathedrals once filled with incense and psalms became battlegrounds. Monks fought pilgrims in the aisles, zealots burned libraries of doctrine, and confessional booths were used as barricades. The Ministorum's enforcers, armed with shock mauls and flamers, opened fire in the name of the Emperor. In the catacombs below the Grand Basilica of the Martyr's Crown, High Ecclesiarch Deimos knelt before the ossuary of St. Devalis, clutching the saint's femur relic in both trembling hands. "Speak to me," he whispered. "Give me something, a sign, anything." The relic, once warm with sacred energy, was cold, the silence pressed down like a hand around his throat. When the soldiers broke through the gates hours later, they found Deimos still kneeling, his body lifeless, his lips frozen mid-prayer. The relic had turned to ash in his grasp. Across the Imperium, the contagion of disbelief spread faster than the ecclesiarchy could suppress it. Cardinal worlds tore themselves apart in holy purges, each sect accusing the others of treachery, each claiming to hold the true flame of devotion. In the confusion, new heresies bloomed like weeds through cracked stone. One sect proclaimed that the Emperor's silence was proof of ascension, that he had moved beyond the mortal realm into something greater, leaving mankind to prove itself worthy. Another whispered that the God Emperor had died centuries ago, and what the faithful felt was merely the echo of his corpse dream. In the vaults of the Schola Progenium, inquisitors burned records that dared to mention the fading. The Ordo Hereticus declared a new kind of sin, unbelief in thought, and began executing Psykers whose minds betrayed even a flicker of uncertainty. Yet for every heretic they silenced, 10 more arose. The fires of faith no longer purified, they consumed. On distant shrine worlds, the Sisterhood of the Bloody Veil held their last mass inside a fortress chapel as mobs surrounded them. Their leader, Canoness Ara Helene, stood at the altar, her flamer in one hand and her rosary in the other. "If faith dies," she said, "then we will burn its corpse to light the dark." When the doors broke, she pressed the ignition rune. The explosion consumed the chapel and the thousands outside it, a final act of devotion or defiance. From orbit, the surface of the planet glowed like a candle guttering in the wind. On Terra, the news was received in whispers. The Ecclesiarch's palace locked its gates. Within the inner sanctums of the imperial palace, where even whispers could be treason, Custodian Halix Orpheon stood beside the Sister of Silence once more. Below them, the city burned in places unseen by the cameras of the Ministorum. "Faith holds the Imperium together," Halix murmured. "If it burns, what remains?" The sister did not answer, but turned her gaze toward the sky. The Astronomican's light, once blinding even through the clouds, seemed pale now, waning like the last flame of a dying star. And across the heavens, something unseen stirred. Not demonic, not divine, simply vast, watching, waiting to see whether humanity's faith would end in ash, or evolve into something new. The silence that had spread through the Imperium did not stop at the veil of reality. It reached into the warp itself. For millennia, the warp had been a storm of chaos and emotion, a place where the faith of humanity burned as psychic fire, where saints and sinners alike were made of thought and fury. But now, for the first time, that storm began to still. In the librarius of the battle barge Vigilant Dawn, astropath Elian Cord awoke screaming. His mind was tuned to the Astronomican, the Emperor's light that guided the Imperium through the void. For years, that psychic beacon had been a constant brilliance in the darkness, a pillar of golden flame cutting through the insanity of the immaterium. Now it flickered, weak as a dying candle. In the moment between pulses, he heard something else, a whisper that came from nowhere and everywhere. It was not demonic, nor divine. It was simply aware. He tried to focus, reaching through the threads of the warp as he had 1,000 times before. What he found there was wrong. The currents no longer raged and screamed, they waited. And beneath that stillness, he sensed countless presences staring back at him, their attention cold, analytical, curious. It was not the cacophony of chaos, but something new. The void listening to the prayers that no longer had a god to answer them. Elian staggered to his feet, blood running from his eyes. "He's gone," he whispered. "He's gone, and the warp knows it." Within days, similar reports came from across the Imperium. Psykers collapsed mid-ritual, their minds flooded with impossible visions. Cathedrals made of bone and silence, saints with mouths sewn shut, the Astronomican pulsing like a dying heart. The Ordos declared the incidents contained, but word spread faster than denial could silence it. Something vast was stirring beyond the veil. In the Segmentum Pacificus, the Navigator House of Varian held a convocation. Their chart rooms were filled with panic. "The currents have reversed," one navigator cried. "The Emperor's light bends upon itself." When they attempted translation, their ships vanished into nothing. No warp signature, no distress call. It was as if the universe itself had refused them passage. On Terra, the choir of the Astronomicans struggled to maintain the beacon. Their number was already reduced. Most had burned out in their devotion. Now even the strongest among them felt the Emperor's will recede. They redoubled their chanting, their throats raw, their minds breaking. The chamber smelled of iron and incense. Still, the golden light flickered. Halix Orpheon stood among the observers, the hum of the machines echoing in his skull. For days, he had felt something gathering, a pressure on the edges of thought. As he watched the Psykers writhe, their eyes white with agony, he heard the same whisper Elian Cord had heard across the stars. It slid between the words of the chant, soft, almost gentle. "Why do you call to what is already within you?" Halix froze. He could not tell if the voice came from within his mind or from beyond it. He turned toward the throne's distant glow. The light pulsed once, weak and uneven. The voice came again, quieter now. "You built your god in your own image. Now face the silence he left behind." He fell to one knee, his breath shallow, his armor heavy as stone. All around him, the Psykers screamed, their bodies arching as invisible fire consumed them. The Astronomican blazed brighter for a heartbeat, then dimmed to half its strength. The Adeptus Custodes reacted instantly, locking the chamber down. The surviving Psykers were dragged away, their minds burned hollow. The Mechanicus attendants began their litanies, desperate to stabilize the psychic conduits, but Halix could only stare at the fading light. Later, alone in the echoing corridors, he could still hear that voice, a memory of a sound that didn't belong to any god he knew. It wasn't promise or threat, it was indifference. In the dark of the warp, something was changing. Demons that once fed on devotion now shrank back, hissing as if starving. The great entities of chaos raged in confusion. Faith had been their nourishment as much as mankind's shield. Now, as that faith decayed, the warp's tides shifted in unpredictable ways. Whole star systems vanished behind storms that refused to roar. Ships that entered the void reported quiet. And for those few Psykers still strong enough to see, that quiet was not absence. It was attention. Something vast was watching humanity from across the void. Something that had no name, no hunger, no faith of its own. It did not offer damnation or salvation. It only waited. Perhaps it was the echo of the Emperor, transformed into something no longer human. Perhaps it was the warp itself, awakening to consciousness after millennia of feeding on dreams. Or perhaps it was nothing at all, just the sound of faith dying, and the universe listening as its last echo faded. Whatever it was, it marked the end of an age, and as the Astronomican's light dimmed again, flickering like the last heartbeat of a dying god, Hallex understood the truth he had feared all along. The Imperium had never been protected by the Emperor's power. It had been protected by belief, and belief was bleeding out into the dark. The Astronomican had always been the heartbeat of humanity. For 10,000 years, its golden pulse had cut through the black sea of the warp, guiding fleets, sustaining hope, whispering across the void that the Emperor still watched, still cared. But now, that light was fading. From orbit above Terra, the great psychic lens array of the Astronomican trembled under the strain of its dying radiance. The choir pit within, the chamber where thousands of souls were sacrificed each day to feed the beacon, reeked of ozone, incense, and burned flesh. Where once the psychic hum had been a blinding chorus of divine purpose, now it was fragmented, fractured, and thin as a dying breath. Hallex Orpheon stood upon the observation deck overlooking the Astronomican spire. The sight was both awe-inspiring and horrifying. The once golden beam that had stretched through the heavens now sputtered, flickering from gold to pale white, to a sickly grey that barely pierced the upper atmosphere. It reminded him of the candles that had burned in Myrea's basilica on Caradon Primus, candles that had guttered in silence when the hymns first failed. He could hear the faint screams of the choir, thousands of Psykers writhing in unison as the beacon faltered. Their pain had once been holy, a necessary suffering to sustain the Imperium. Now it felt empty, ritual without sanctity, sacrifice without meaning. The Mechanicus priests attending the system chanted louder, their mechanical limbs jerking in rhythm with failing faith. They poured more power into the conduits, overloading the reactors beneath the spire. The ground trembled, ozone filled the air like blood in water, and still, the Astronomican dimmed. Hallex turned to the Sister of Silence, who stood beside him. For weeks she had been his silent companion, an unbreakable mirror to his unraveling conviction. Her presence had once unnerved him. Now he found solace in it. She did not demand answers. She did not pray. She simply was. "You feel it, don't you?" he said quietly. "The dying of something greater than us, the unraveling of what we built our souls upon." She did not move, but her eyes softened. In her silence, he sensed agreement. A junior custodian approached, his voice tight beneath the mask of discipline. "Lord Orpheon, reports from Segmentum Tempestus. Entire fleets lost translation. Navigators blind. The Astronomican's reach has fallen by nearly half." Half. The word echoed through Hallex like a wound. He dismissed the custodian with a nod and turned back to the dying light. Half the Imperium was now in darkness. He imagined those worlds, the endless cities and frozen moons that had once looked up to the stars with faith. What did they see now? A sky without guidance, without warmth, the void creeping closer each night. The realization that even gods could wither. He remembered the voice that had whispered through the warp, the one that had told him to stop searching. He had tried to bury it, but it lingered like a scar in his mind. You built your god in your own image. Now face the silence he left behind. Perhaps this was not death. Perhaps it was revelation. Below the spire, the choir reached its crescendo. The Psykers screamed in a single, unified agony, their minds burning as one. For a moment, the light surged, brilliant, blinding, the full force of humanity's desperation made manifest. The decks trembled. Vox feeds overloaded. Every heart on Terra seemed to stop as the Astronomican roared back to life. Bright, golden, divine, and then, as suddenly as it came, the light collapsed. The golden beam flickered one last time and died. The world fell silent, Halix felt the loss like a physical blow. His knees buckled, gauntleted hands gripping the rail as alarms screamed through the chamber. The psychic pressure in the air evaporated, leaving a void so deep it felt like the entire planet had exhaled and forgotten to breathe again. Mechanicus adepts scrambled, their Binharic prayers turning into panicked static. Vox traffic flooded with the same phrase repeated across every frequency. Astronomican dark, astronomican dark, astronomican dark. For the first time in living memory, the light of the Emperor had gone out. Halix raised his gaze to the sky beyond the spire's dome. The heavens were black, not the comforting darkness of night, but the absolute void of a universe without a center. He felt the old fear, primal and ancient, the terror of being truly alone. The Sister of Silence stepped closer. Her hand brushed the edge of his gauntlet, the faintest gesture of comfort. "It cannot end this way," Halix whispered, voice raw. "He cannot have left us." The sister looked up at the darkened spire, then back at him. There was no faith in her eyes, no despair either, only understanding. The Astronomicon had gone dark, but the Imperium still lived. The fleets would still fight. Humanity would still endure. Not out of faith, but out of habit, defiance, and the stubborn refusal to die. Halix turned from the dead light. "Then we endure," he said. "Even without him." The sister nodded once, the faintest movement in the quiet. And as they stood together beneath the cold sky, far beyond their sight, in the deep ocean of the warp, something vast stirred. Something neither god nor demon, but born of both. The echo of 10,000 years of prayer lingered there, coiling through the psychic dark like smoke. Whether it would ignite again or vanish forever, no one could say. Night never truly fell on Terra. Its skies, thick with the glow of industry and the faint psychic haze of the throne's emissions, were always some shade of dim gold. But now, as the Astronomicon died, even that faint shimmer faded. The world that had once been the axis of the Imperium's faith descended into true darkness for the first time since the Age of Strife. The fires of the cathedrals guttered, the plasma towers dimmed, and the air carried the sound of a city holding its breath. Vox traffic had slowed to murmurs. Even the constant roar of the manufactorums seemed muted, as though the entire planet was listening for a sound that would not come. The Emperor's silence had become absolute. Halix Orpheon walked the empty halls of the Sanctum Imperialis like a ghost. His armor, once radiant in gold, seemed dull and lifeless beneath the dying light. The banners of the Imperium, once symbols of unbreakable glory, hung like shrouds, their colors swallowed by shadow. He had seen wars that tore galaxies apart, seen demons claw through the veil of reality, seen the Emperor's will manifest as light and fury, but he had never seen this. The absence, the stillness, the terrible peace of a world without faith. He descended again into the lower sanctums, past the prayer chambers where the Psykers had perished, past the marble statues of saints whose eyes had once seemed alive. The air was cold and dry, and each step echoed like the toll of a bell. At the base of the grand stair, he found her, the Sister of Silence. She stood before the sealed doors of the throne chamber, her figure framed by the dim light leaking through the cracks above. Her face, pale and calm, betrayed nothing. Halix approached, his voice hoarse. "The light is gone." She inclined her head slightly, acknowledgement without surprise. "They will come soon," he said. "The cardinals, the lords of terror, the Inquisition, they will demand to know what remains. They will build new lies to fill the void. They will say he speaks through silence." Her eyes met his. "They said what she could not. Then let them." Halix shook his head. "No, someone must remember the truth." He turned toward the sealed doors. Beyond them lay the golden throne, and upon it, the husk of the Emperor, the god who had guided humanity, who had demanded faith and received blood. The machine still hummed faintly, but that hum was now mechanical, not divine. The pulse of his power was gone. Halix fell to one knee before the door. His gauntlets scraped against the marble, leaving faint streaks of gold. "All my life I believed my service was devotion," he said, "that by guarding you I preserved meaning itself. But now I see, faith is not devotion. It is dependence, and I have lived as its prisoner." The sister took a step closer, her expression unreadable. The faint shimmer of her null field brushed against him, cold, empty, yet strangely cleansing. He closed his eyes. For the first time, he prayed, not to the Emperor, but to whatever remained in the vast silence that surrounded them. "If you are gone," he whispered, "then let us be what you could not. Let us endure without miracles. Let us remember what it means to be human, even in the dark." He waited for an answer, knowing there would be none. But then, in that stillness, something stirred. Not in the air, not in the warp, but in him. It was small at first, almost imperceptible. The warmth of memory, the faces of those who had fought and died believing their faith mattered, the sound of Sister Morea's voice on Caradon Primus, the dying light in St. Virelia's eyes, the weight of their devotion, futile yet beautiful. It was not divine, it was not eternal, but it was real. He rose slowly, his voice quiet. "Perhaps that is enough." The sister turned to him, and for the first time, he saw the faintest trace of expression, something soft, fragile. Perhaps it was sorrow, perhaps it was hope. Together they opened the great doors. The throne chamber lay before them, vast and dim. The Emperor's body sat unmoving upon his gilded seat, shrouded in cables and light. The golden glow that had once filled the chamber was gone, replaced by the cold white shimmer of dying machinery. Halix stepped forward, his footsteps echoing in the emptiness. He looked up at the face that had once been humanity's god. The eyes were dark. The air smelled of old metal and dust. He did not kneel this time. He simply stood, watching, waiting. When he spoke, his voice was steady. "You will not speak again, and that is well, because we must learn to speak for ourselves." He reached out one hand, touching the edge of the throne. The metal was cold, lifeless. Somewhere deep within, a relay sparked, an almost inaudible crackle of power. For a single instant, the golden light flickered again, illuminating the chamber. Halix froze. The sister's head turned sharply toward the glow. It was faint, fleeting, but it was there. The throne hummed once, then fell silent again. Perhaps it had been a malfunction. Perhaps it had been coincidence. But as the darkness returned, neither spoke. Halix closed his eyes. "If that was you, my Emperor," he whispered, "then know this. We will endure, not because you saved us, but because you taught us how." The sister bowed her head. The air was still. The throne remained silent, and somewhere far above, in the void where the Astronomicon had burned, a faint pulse of light shimmered, no longer constant, but not entirely gone. A breath between heartbeats, a whisper between worlds, the beginning of something that might one day be faith again. It was said that when the Emperor first ascended to the Golden Throne, the universe itself had trembled, that the warp had bent in reverence, that the very stars had flickered like candles before the birth of a god. Now, 10,000 years later, there was no tremor, no divine proclamation, only the slow unraveling of that ancient light and the quiet reckoning of those left behind. In the days following the Astronomicon's death, terror did not fall into chaos, it fell into waiting. The faithful gathered before their darkened shrines, still mouthing prayers that went nowhere. The Mechanicus sealed the lower sanctums of the palace, declaring the throne in calibration. The ecclesiarchy flooded the Vox networks with proclamations that the silence was a trial, that the Emperor had turned his gaze inward to purge sin. But even their voices trembled. Words alone could not replace the light that had guided humanity for millennia. Halix Orpheon spent those days walking among the people, something no custodian had done in living memory. His armor, dimmed by dust, drew stares of awe and fear, but he did not speak. He watched the masses light candles that refused to burn, watched a child offer a cracked aquila to a priest who no longer knew what blessing to give. He saw despair, yes, but beneath it, something else, the stubborn pulse of survival. When night fell, he returned to the throne chamber. The Sister of Silence was already there, her presence as constant as gravity. Together they stood before the dead god. The machines surrounding the throne still hummed, their conduits breathing like dying lungs. The air shimmered faintly with residual psychic energy, a ghost of what had once been infinite power. Halix spoke softly, more to himself than to her. They will begin to rewrite it soon. The ecclesiarchs, the magi, the scribes, they will tell the next generation that this was prophecy fulfilled, that the Emperor sleeps to rise again. They will drown truth in scripture until none remember what truly died. The sister's silence was its own answer. She lifted her gaze to the Emperor's still form, the flesh that had once held infinity, now motionless within the web of gold and steel. Her face reflected the faint glimmer of dying light. Helix exhaled slowly. Perhaps it is better that way. Perhaps hope, even false, is worth more than truth. He removed his helmet and set it gently at his feet. For a long time he said nothing. Then quietly, "But someone must remember. Someone must carry the truth of what faith cost." The sister's eyes met his, and for a heartbeat, he thought he saw understanding, or maybe forgiveness. They remained there for what felt like hours, watching the flickering conduits fade to darkness. The last reserves of psychic energy drained into the throne's core, lighting the Emperor's corpse in one final shimmer of gold. It was not the brilliance of divinity, but the fragile, human glow of something ending with grace. Helix knelt one final time, not in worship but in farewell. "We built our God upon the bones of reason and the ashes of fear," he whispered. "We gave him our faith until we forgot what it was to believe in ourselves. If you ever hear us again, my lord, let it be not as your servants, but as your children." A long silence followed. Then, impossibly, faintly, the light within the throne pulsed once. It was not bright, it was not grand, just a single, gentle heartbeat of gold that brushed the edges of perception before fading into the void. Helix froze, unsure if it was real or the cruel trick of exhaustion. The sister too had turned toward the light, her expression unreadable. Neither spoke. For a long time the two stood there in that quiet, surrounded by the dying hum of machines and the echo of everything humanity had ever believed. The silence was not empty, it was vast. The space between faith and understanding, between prayer and answer. Finally, Helix lowered his head. "Maybe that is the answer," he said softly. "Not a miracle, not a voice, just the choice to go on." He turned and began walking toward the great doors. The sister followed, her steps silent as shadow. Behind them, the throne remained still. The faint golden spark that had flickered moments ago lingered in the air like memory, then vanished. Outside, terror was dark, but not dead. In the streets, people had begun to light fires of their own, crude, mortal flames, not holy, not divine, but real. Their smoke rose into the starless sky, 1,000 tiny prayers not to gods, but to one another. Helix paused on the steps of the sanctum and looked upward. For the first time in his long life, he saw the night as it truly was, black, infinite, uncaring, yet full of possibility. He smiled faintly, the expression strange on a face made for duty, not peace. "Perhaps this is what he wanted all along," he murmured, "for us to walk without the light and still find our way." Far above, beyond sight and time, something stirred in the warp. Not power, not wrath, but memory, the echo of 10,000 years of faith, still whispering, still seeking form. It did not speak, but if one listened closely, one might have thought it breathed. For a heartbeat, a spark appeared in the darkness, faint, golden, fragile. Then it was gone, and the galaxy, vast and wounded, continued to turn, alone, enduring, and, for the first time in an age, free.